Welcome everybody to the inaugural event hosted by the Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism on the Repatriation of Extremists. We're delighted to bring you a fantastic panel to discuss the moral, legal and security grounds for returning citizens who have traveled to Syria to join the terrorist organization, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. No doubt this is a topic that is both sensitive and controversial, but our aim as a non-partisan organization is to provide an honest, respectful and open discussion on the issues of our time to generate some light, not heat. We would like to extend a big thank you to our sponsors for this event, T45, a new news service providing the facts that we need in this age of misinformation. Throughout this event, you in the audience will have the opportunity to engage with each other via the chat bar on the side. Just like the panelists, we are encouraging you to converse with one another as the discussion develops. Our discussion will last around 45 minutes with 10 minutes left at the end for questions. So if you press the raise hand option in our last segment, I'll be able to unmute you and you can pose questions directly at our panelists. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts. We have today Dominic Casciani, Home Affairs Correspondent for the BBC, who throughout his career has reported extensively on security and terrorism. Dominic will be a fantastic contextual guide in this discussion. We have Tasnime Akunjee, the lawyer for the families of the Bethnal Trio. That is the 3 schoolgirls, one of whom, of course, was Shamima Begum, who left the UK in 2015 to join ISIS. We have Rashad Ali, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Rashad is a leading counter-terrorism practitioner and an expert in radicalization and reintegration. We're very lucky to have him on. We also have Robin Simcox, Director at the Counter Extremism Group. Robin is a specialist in national security policy and counter-terrorism. He has testified before Congress on multiple occasions on issues related to ISIS. It really is a glittering selection of CVs. Thank you all for donating your time to come onto our platform today. We're really grateful to have you on for our first event. So without further ado, let's get started. I think context is essential for this discussion. So Dominic, I'm going to defer to you. Could you provide us with an overview of the background that kind of frames the proposal to repatriate ISIS foreign supporters?
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for all those who've joined to listen in on this topic. Look, I'm not going to express any opinions. I'm a BBC journalist. My job is to kind of just try and get facts out there and leave others to form their view about it. But the one opinion I will give you is those who've bought a licence fee, thank you very much, because it keeps a roof over my head. And those of you who haven't, please go and buy one, because we do some terribly good things. There you go. That's my plug-in. Let me talk in very brief, broad terms about the issue here, because my fellow panelists here, because they are day in day out practitioners in this stuff. They will have a lot of the nuance and the very deep stuff, which I'm not going to go into. What we're talking about is an absolutely phenomenal moment in history between effectively roughly 2013 and 2019, with the rise of what became known as the Caliphate and its destruction by 2019. And over that period, roughly 40,000 people from almost every part of the world went to fight in the Syria and Iraq region. Now, when you break those numbers down, it's quite remarkable to look at where they came from and what dragged them there. You had 7,000 or so, sorry, I beg your pardon, you had about half the numbers came from the Middle East itself. Some of that was legacy issues from the Iraq war. Some of it was from further afield from other theatres as well. About 7,000 people came from Eastern Europe. A lot of that was linked to the Caucasus and about enduring jihadist issues in that part of the world. 6,000 from Western Europe, and within that, about 2,000 people, fighters and their families from France. The UK, about 950 people, we now think. That number's kind of crept up and been slowly developed and nuanced over the last few years by the security service and other security officials in Whitehall. Now, when you look at those 950, I think this is where it gets interesting in terms of what happened to them. Around half of the 950 UK nationals who went out to the area which became the Caliphate, who effectively went out as foreign fighters to join IS or other jihadist groups, around half of them came back. And that's probably because they came back because they weren't actually as engaged as they thought they were going to be by the time they got there. And a lot of them came back in the early days. And I've met some of these people down the years, people who put their head above the parapet and talked about effectively going out and, a little bit of a complicated situation, what went on there. Maybe a third of them are dead. They actually got involved in fighting and they lost their lives. Of the remainder, it's very complicated to know what's happened to them. Some of them are in refugee camps, some of them in detention. The Syrian Kurds, for example, have been holding about 1,000 people. Some of them escaped to other parts of the region, and some of them are still on the loose, effectively on the run from security services in areas around northwest Syria, where it is still exceptionally chaotic. So you've got this big problem out there of what you're going to do with all these people, not just the Brits, but people from other countries as well. Now, clearly, the powers that be in the region don't want these people there, but that then poses a problem for the countries where these people have come from. Washington, for instance, wants the countries involved to take these foreign fighters back. Turkey wants these people out of the region as well. It's a big problem. What do you do with them? How do you deal with justice in this situation? Now, there are then also practical issues. If you wanted to bring people back, or you chose to bring those people back under some form of kind of international sort of obligation and duress, how do you practically do that, given the dangers involved in the region? How do you reintegrate somebody when you get them back to the country they came from? And how, if there is potentially evidence available, are you going to prosecute them, given it's very difficult to actually bring somebody to justice for a crime which has been committed potentially on in an entirely different continent? And I'll give an example of this. And a few years ago, I and colleagues were thinking about where's the furthest we can travel on a reasonable budget for the BBC to find somebody who travelled to join IS, and it happened to be Calgary, in the western part of Canada. So you're the police and security services in Canada. It's going to be very, very difficult for you to obtain a lot of the evidence you need to prosecute someone worthy to leave Syria to go back to their home city. So those are some kind of the issues there. Within that, you've got countries doing different things. France has taken back a few. The Danes have tried to reintegrate people. The Brits have had a slightly different view. While some people have clearly been allowed back into the country and have been allowed to reintegrate, there has been an enormous effort to keep others out. And the most well-known example of that is the row which is going on all the way to the Supreme Court of Shamima Begum and whether or not she presents a threat to the UK. The UK keeps people out through a number of means: disruption powers, including cancelling passports, stripping of citizenship, and also a power that prevents British citizens coming back in temporarily until they abide by certain restrictions on their freedoms, so that the security service and MI5 and the police can keep on top of them. So that's kind of what you're looking at in terms of the framework there that sets the question. Very, very difficult problem, pretty much unprecedented in world history, where you've had so many people from so many different countries landed in a region to fight, and then the fight has gone against them. What do you do with those people afterwards?
Thank you very much, Dominic. Very, very informative. Tasnime, can I refer to you now, please, to make your position known?
Sure. Well, my position is less global and more specific in that, I was tasked with trying to help the families of 3 girls from Bethnal Trio Academy get back into the UK, albeit if they're prosecuted or simply just return. Of the 3 girls who went out, only Shamima Begum remains alive, and as we all know, she had her citizenship stripped. The task is, my focus is to have her back into the UK, and the argument that's been levied by the Home Secretary is that she's not conducive to the public good. One of those tools that Dominic simply just referred to was the stripping of citizenship, and that's what's occurred in her particular case. In terms of people who've gone out to join ISIS or other groups and then return, it's right to say there are large numbers who've gone, but it's also important to know that they may have gone for various different reasons. Some of them are men, some of them are women, and some of them are actually children. And also out there are people who are British citizens by dint of their parentage, but were actually born out, they're conceived and born out in a war zone. So when we're talking about returnees, we're talking about quite a different diversity of people, and people, some of which are very dangerous indeed, upper echelon strategic fighters, strategists, bomb makers, people who've got out there and skilled up with a very particular anti-Western view, and certainly one that caused them to leave the UK in the first place and go and join an organization at a given time, let's say 2015, 2016 being the height when ISIS was expressing its negativity towards the West and indeed engaging in terrorist acts. But then there are others who went out to the region to maybe fight against Assad, a sort of a just cause, and have been caught up in that scenario. And then there are the women and children who, some of which are going to be entirely innocent. So we have this range of individuals, range of people who are out there, many of which want to return, and my position is simply this, is that have them assessed and deal with them accordingly. If there's evidence against them, prosecute them in the UK, because frankly, there's nowhere else to prosecute them. And if not, then assess them in terms of a security risk and try and reintegrate them. At the end of the day, there are citizens and there are problems.
Thank you, Tasnime. Robin, could you now give us your thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. It's a fiendishly difficult subject, this, and obviously only got a couple of minutes, so I'll try and make, I'll be somewhat reductive in my comments, and I'm kind of happy to flesh any of them out during the questioning later. My contention is that in general, government should probably assume the worst about some of the foreign fighters at this point, being returning from ISIS-held territory. Many traveled to join ISIS and live in Islamic State-controlled territory, fully aware of the atrocities that were being committed there. I don't buy, to be honest, that, and you still hear this argued, that they were necessarily naive or brainwashed. A lot of them now have conflict experience and terrorist training, and many, we should remember, have already proven themselves in the past to be dangerous. Brussels first suffered casualties from foreign fighters returning from Syria. Someone called Mehdi Namouche, who fought for ISIS in Syria, shot and killed 4 people at the Jewish Museum in Brussels in May 2014. Cell of primarily French and Belgian ISIS returnees from Syria killed 130 and injured almost 400 more in coordinated attacks across Paris in November 2015. And my thought, the first response to the security threat shouldn't actually be reintegration and de-radicalization initiatives, which have a very patchy track record. Instead, it should be a focus primarily on the rule of law. The priority should be prosecution, taking potential terror threats off the street for as long as is legally possible and necessary. As Dominic says, prosecution rarely takes place for various evidentiary reasons, and we can go into more detail on that. But I think it's the best option, because foreign fighters shouldn't be absolved of responsibility for their choices. An emphasis on prosecution doesn't mean there's no place for DRAD initiatives. A successful counterterrorism strategy is going to have multiple components, and obviously children born in the caliphate, or children who had no choice about being taken there in the first place, are obviously very different cases. But overall, I think governments have to prioritize public safety, because we need to be not only thinking about the present threat, but also that may arise in the future. Because I mean, Syria was unique, but it's also not the first conflict that served as a magnet for foreign fighter travel. It's part of a broader trend. And generally, European, and I'd say the West more broadly, Western states stood idle as multiple generations of Islamists traveled to conflict zones across the world, from Bosnia, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Somalia, Yemen, and they did so with very little legal accountability. And I think that doing nothing in these circumstances has consequences as well. And the kind of tolerant attitude towards foreign fighter travel that existed prior to Syria has allowed the problem to mushroom. And the attitude towards foreign fighter travel, I think, has to change, because at some point down the line, there's going to be another Syria. There's going to be another center of gravity for foreign fighter travel. And effective government policy only goes some way in helping to deal with the blowback. I think we also probably need a bit of a mindset shift among wider society, and not look to provide excuses for foreign fighter travel, but instead stress that if this is an act that people, if this is something that people do, there are going to be very clear legal and societal consequences for it.
Fantastic, thank you. Finally, Rashad, would you give us your opinion on the matter?
Yeah, thank you first for inviting me to speak on this panel with the people here. I think a number of ways to view this. First of all, I do not think this is the first of this type. Like Robin said, there has been various points of which have attracted people to go and join various causes. And I don't just mean the romanticism that people like George Monbiot show when he described it as people like going, almost like they're taking up arms against fascism, as George Orwell did, as an example. I remember The Guardian had some kind of romantic piece like that. But actually, there have been conflict zones which people have gone to and been drawn to, whether it was Bosnia with the massacre and the genocide that was taking place by the Serbs, or whether it was, to repel the invasion of the Russians in Afghanistan. There have been various different conflicts. We have taken various different political perspectives on each of these conflicts, and therefore we have turned a blind eye to, or encouraged, or discouraged different people joining different conflicts historically. What there has been, and this is probably a point I differ with on some of the things that have been said, is there is clear guidelines legislatively and policy-wise that state very, very clearly what people can and can't do. So going to an area which is controlled by a terrorist group, joining a terrorist group, affiliating with a terrorist organization, fighting alongside, or merely being a member of, is a crime. So there is already existent legislation on these things. And therefore, there should have been a very clear perspective on where we stand. I think there are questions to be asked about policy failure or implementation failures at a broader level. Vis-a-vis the security question, I agree. The biggest question really is security. And I don't think their security is maintained, or our security rather, is maintained by not knowing where these individuals are. I think it's a very simple thing to say that we are safer and more secure when we know when they are, and ideally when they're under custody. Vis-a-vis the primary focus, I agree that we have a counterterrorism strategy, we have legislation in place, and that should be implemented. The rule of law should be fundamental and basic, which means individuals that do return, if we can prosecute them, we should prosecute them. And actually, there's some mythology surrounding the other European countries, like Denmark, etc. They have exactly the same framework as us. If you have an individual and you can prove crimes they have committed, they will be and have been prosecuted. It's just that they're proselytized a lot more about their wonderful repatriation, reintegration programs that they have. And I'm fairly familiar with this. We've implemented similar programs in places like Lebanon. So it's based upon and alongside the Danish government. So it's not that I'm unfamiliar with the nature of their programs. It's probably that their propaganda about what they're focusing on is better than what they actually do. And lastly, I think when it comes to this, and you did mention this in your introduction, we are missing a big context here, which is this is not the problem of Syrians and Iraqis. They've kind of suffered enough of several thousand Europeans going over there on their imperialist jolly to go and join these proto-fascist organizations like ISIS to go and fight. And many individuals have suffered the consequences of this. We owe it the minimum to them that we will take back, some of the failures of our society, like these individuals, and prosecute whatever the next steps are, engage in accordingly. And I don't think it's fair to say, well, we're not going to take them, so let's just leave them to the US to deal with.
Thank you, Rashad. Thank you all actually for making your thoughts known. I think the first question we should kind of discuss is the security-based one. Is it a greater threat to national security to leave these individuals abroad, or do we take better onus for it by bringing them home? How about, who would like to start us off?
I'll kick off with that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Sure, I think that question's been answered actually by the British government already recently with the Hasham Abdi case, in that that's a UK citizen who was the brother of the guy who engaged in the Manchester attack. He was born in Manchester, fled to Libya before the attack itself, was captured in Libya, extradited back to the UK, faced a trials, now got 55 years in prison before parole. So I didn't really understand the UK government's position with Shamima Begum when they say that someone who's a woman with very little evidence about anything she's done other than going out to join ISIS is left out to rot in a refugee camp, whilst you have somebody who's a very serious, credible threat, someone who's been proved to be a credible threat, who's been hunted down in Libya, brought back to the UK, and then prosecuted. So clearly, Mr. Abdi was much more of a threat on any scale than Shamima Begum. But also to take Robin's point about rule of law, I think that's the most important thing, particularly from a legal point of view, is the rule of law. And the idea that we bring people and prosecute them according to evidence is the very fundamental basis of rule of law. The problem that I have with your logic, Robin, is that you assume that anyone who's gone out there is a very serious threat, and therefore, you know, the rule of law shouldn't apply. They should just be assumed to be a threat. And that's been the fundamental problem I have with the approach the UK government's taken with people like Shamima Begum, is that it's a one brush stroke that tars everybody on the same level.
Robin, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean the assumption of threat. I mean, obviously, I mean it goes without saying that, or maybe it should be said that there are different levels of threat from different returnees. I mean, obviously there are some people who have proved themselves to be a threat foreign fighter wise. There are others who have obviously returned and not carried out an attack or anything like that. So obviously there are different threat levels. But my assumption, or I would portray it more as that I have a low threshold for risk. And I have a low threshold for risk because we've lost an awful lot of lives in this country over the past few years to terrorist attacks. And so I am cautious on this subject. I make no apologies for that. I am cautious for it. And that's part of the reason, you know, we're talking a bit about stopping people returning to the country from the UK perspective. I think we also have to look, if we have to look at this as the security side of things, and then there's if we kind of look at the politics of it, obviously there are not many Home Secretaries that are going to put themselves out there and say, we want to bring people back that we assess to be a security threat. So if you just look at this from a political point of view, it's a tough sell in many ways, which I understand people may not be content with that on a human rights perspective or a judicial perspective, but it is going into the mix and in the way in which these decisions are made.
To come back on that, I mean, you're talking about the Home Secretary who herself took the political risk of sitting against her own government's wishes with the IDF and promising the IDF UK foreign aid funds to support them. And this is whilst the IDF were actually providing small arms to rebel forces in the Syrian conflict. So effectively supporting ISIS and the ilk with arms. So the idea that there's a political risk that this particular Home Secretary isn't happy to take, well, that's a difficult swallow with Priti Patel, I think.
I wonder whether it's actually interesting to bring in public opinion before the framing. There's a sense I feel that many in the public just don't like the idea of somebody going out to join ISIS, violating UK law, and then being allowed to just be returned at the taxpayers' money. Would anyone like to contribute to a discussion on that?
Can I just actually throw in a few real examples of other Brits into this, actually, just to help sort of frame the debate? You know, these are real world examples of where people have come back. So the first one I was going to mention is a woman called Tirina Shaquille, who was from Burton-upon-Trent, and she went out to join IS and she came back. And in 2016, she was jailed for membership, basically membership of a prescribed organization. She hadn't been a fighter. She'd gone out basically, you know, to get herself a husband. And in doing so, she supported the organization. Now, she came back and she lied to the authorities about why she'd come back. They didn't trust her, so they went for her. and she paid the price by going to jail. So that is an example of actually how someone can be brought back, where there's no evidence of involvement in fighting, but the support, the moral support and the material support she gave actually led to the sentence. Another example is a man called Imran Khawaja. Imran Khawaja went out to fight during the early stages. And in fact, he was seen, photographed in some absolutely horrific scenes on social media. He faked his own death to come back to the UK and slipped back into the UK. It was simply not clear what his intentions were. But the authorities, they managed to get enough together in terms of evidence to actually charge him, largely partly because of the stuff he'd put out on social media, or friends of his put out on social media about what he'd been up to. So there are routes to getting these people who have been in Syria, to getting them actually physically into court, but it's very, very difficult to do because gathering the evidence out there is enormously difficult to do. Now the interesting thing is, of course, is once they're jailed, ultimately most of these people at some point are going to then have to come out of jail, and then that's where you have a real issue about the management of these people afterwards. And that's, I suspect Robin's point on this, this kind of plays to Robin's point about the risk factor in this, but there are ways of getting these people into the country and then getting them into jail as well.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good segue. If we could talk a bit now about kind of the blowback rate, the idea that those who return are going to commit crimes again. Rashad, would you like to start us off on this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things just before I comment on that. Firstly, it is true to say that Priti Patel was providing aid on behalf of, I think it was DFID, without full disclosure to Syrian opposition groups, which wasn't ISIS or Al-Qaeda. I think it's just important to bear that in mind by the IDF, because I think it's just, there seems to be this generalization about Syrian opposition as though ISIS and AQ form the opposition. Actually, most of it is not that. And on that point, it is more complicated. The individuals that went out to Syria from 2012, 13, 14, were very different necessarily to the ones who went out with a specific intent post 2014 to go and join ISIS. They are very, very different, and it's important to bear that kind of context in mind as well. On that note, we have been dealing with people that have returned from conflict zones in our de-radicalization efforts for some time. We've formalized that process now, both in terms of looking at the psychiatry of these individuals, the psychology, the ideology of these individuals, and seeing, can they be de-radicalized? Can we remove the ideological motivations? Can we remove the social, psychological motivations? And can we provide a safe place for them to be reintegrated within society? That is a general issue with all types of ideologically inspired criminality of all persuasions. Whether it's far right, whether it's Islamist, whether there's going to be more and more of this kind of mixed ideology or hard leftist individuals engaging in political violence and so on. So I think in that sense, we do have a large policy framework, a set of laws, a very, very specific, well-developed process to do so. That doesn't mean that it's infallible. Of course it's fallible, because we're dealing with human beings and rehabilitation of human beings, which is notoriously difficult and poses a lot of different challenges. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that just because something poses challenges or is difficult that we don't do that. Our entire legal system is premised upon a set of principles that makes it difficult for prosecutions to take place, because the idea is the burden of proof lies upon the one making the case. In practice, obviously, that is different, depending upon if you're found with a knife in your hand and blood dripping down, then you need to explain that circumstance away. But essentially, the idea is the burden of proof lies on the state in order to prosecute. That's the same in all matters. The issue here is the emotive nature of the discussion. The emotive nature of the discussion is when we're talking about individuals who maybe are not repentant, who are very, very clearly, when you speak to the individuals, they're very, very clearly still hostile to our society. They very, very clearly have desires to commit heinous crimes, and some of them have done so, where lots of lives are lost. And so the emotive nature of that discussion can sometimes blind us to it. And it is true what Robin said, that actually 70% of the British populace seems to not want us to repatriate these individuals, at least in some of the surveys. And so politicians are stuck between either sticking by the principle of the rule of law or giving into the mob. And surprisingly enough, giving into the mob is easier, especially when there's a very difficult security challenge to face, which they don't really know how to deal with, let's be honest. Because some of the challenges we haven't discussed are things like, how do we, in a situation where we're fairly sure individuals have been affiliated with terrorist groups and we can't prosecute them because of all sorts of evidentiary criteria, what can and can't be used as evidence, how do we then mitigate the security challenge in that circumstance? These are real questions which involve things like balancing the individual's rights and the safety of a wider society and community. And that is a difficult question, and people have various views about all of those issues, as well as understanding, yes, like any other criminal who needs rehabilitation, de-radicalization is a very, very specific thing that requires our efforts and focus. And it isn't exactly something that we have a large history of and a long science of generations handed down of successful de-radicalization programs to look back on.
Just coming on that, I mean, I was involved in a trial to do with a fellow called Rashad Ali, who had joined the Taliban, stayed out there for some 7 or 8 years, became a bit of a bomb maker, and came back. He actually came back on UK issued travel documents, and was then monitored in the UK, left to his own devices for a while, eventually appeared to engage in what was a proto-terroristic act, which was stopped fairly early on, but he was managed very, very successfully by the security services in the community. Now, it took a lot of resources, but I think that's one person. The problem with the ISIS paradigm scenario now is just the scale of the problem, the diversity and the scale of the number of retainees that may potentially come, and how to manage that with the resources that will require. Now, we've all seen how some of the people in the camps are behaving. That's been on our TV screens fairly regularly, and the hostility towards everyone other than the people in those camps is pretty palpable. I mean, some of those camps, the sort of the remnants of ISIS have been murdering their own because they're not ICC enough really for their own tastes. So we do have a scale issue here as well. And I think that's really the biggest problem. I think if you deal with any individual, you can very quickly form a view or reasonable view around what sort of capacity or danger they pose. But if you suddenly have to take 600 people back of all different varieties, I don't know, maybe Rashad can help with what our resourcing around even assessment of those people would be like, and where would they be kept. So I completely accept that in this particular scenario, there is a problem with our legal the legal rights owed to those people versus the scale of the problem being dealt with all at the same time. And if we do slow that down, well, where does that triage process take place? And for us, the very obvious and simple thing to do is bring the kids over, or the orphan kids over, as quickly as possible. There's just simply there's no excuse for leaving children in that scenario. And then thereafter, you start working up the ranks in terms of families and women and children, and then to the really pernicious problem of the men or some of the more senior women. But I don't know what that triage process would look like, because it doesn't look like there's anywhere stable that outside the UK anyway that would be willing or able to take that task on.
Can I make a point on your blowback question?
Absolutely.
I think we've got to be aware that there's differing forms of what blowback could look like from returnees, right? So when most people think about this, for understandable purposes, their mind goes to returnees carrying out terrorist attacks, killing, injuring people and ruining people's lives. But that's generally not the thing that we should, that's probably not the most common concern, I think, or at least the most common concern we should have. If we think of past conflicts, I think of a conflict like Bosnia, for example, in the early 1990s, there were people that returned from that conflict who obviously were never prosecuted and never carried out a terrorist attack, didn't really present any threat to life in the UK. But the gravitas that they earned and the credibility they earned through taking place in that conflict enabled them to radicalize a whole generation of others in the future. I think a specific example of this, if we need one, is somebody who was pleaded guilty to terrorism offences in the US after a long extradition fight, which was somebody called Baba Ahmed, who fought in Bosnia, returned to the UK, became one of the very key radicalisers in the UK, specifically and especially in South London, was eventually extradited to the US and convicted of terrorism charges there. But there was never any suggestion that Baba Ahmed was planning a terrorist atrocity in the UK or anything like that. But he was a returning fighter who was able to inspire others to go to training camps, for example, in Afghanistan and join Al-Qaeda. So there are different forms of blowback we should be aware of here.
So coming in on that, Robin, I'm just a bit concerned by that approach, because you've taken a temporal line that's decades long, where there were completely different rules in place along those ways. No offence in the UK was committed, but you have one individual who has a particular history, and then you're using that one example to say, well, actually, this may apply to so many others, therefore we should exclude an entire class of people. That's a very, very tenuous argument, really.
What do you mean exclude an entire class of people?
Well, if people have gone abroad for whatever purpose, we don't know what purpose that is. Barbara Ahmed went to fight, we know that. But if there's, Shamima Begum went out to become, let's say, a housewife, does she fall within the category of the same thing that Barbara Ahmed may have gone on to do? Does we assume that she's going to go and do the same thing, do we?
No, we don't assume, and I think I said at the start of my preference as well is prosecution in these cases. But we have to be aware of what has occurred in the past, and we can't just assume, we can't just think of this as who is going to come back and try and commit a terrorist attack. The point I'm making is that there are various forms of security threats that present themselves, and not all of them look like suicide bombers or people trying to kill people with knives or cars on the streets of the UK. There are people who act as pernicious influencers throughout different communities in the UK, and they've used their, we know from past examples, there are past examples of people who have used their credibility from foreign fighter travel to inspire others to do the same. I think it's a thing that's worth considering.
Mm-hmm.
I can't be certain about this, but I may be the only person on this call who's actually met Barbara Ahmed. I fought a very long court case against the government for the right to actually go into prison to interview him, because we thought his case was so significant. And I think the point about the Barbara Ahmed case is taken from the starting point of a man who actually went out to fight what he saw as a just war in Bosnia in relation to saving lives of people who were in the middle of an awful potential genocide and humanitarian crisis. The case against him was that he effectively became a founder or popularizer of jihadism in English in the UK, and then wider through the internet as well. And that was where he was seen as a threat. And it wasn't necessarily what he was doing in terms of actually actively trying to organize attacks. There was never any evidence of that. But that was where the fear was around him. So I think in some respects, it's a slightly different issue to those who come back to actually do attack planning. So the point is, you have people come back for different reasons and different motivations and to do different things, and how you actually manage those people, that's a very practical issue. Just coming back to just another point that from Taz there on Khalid Ali. Khalid Ali spent a long time with the Taliban. When he was arrested, he was carrying 3 knives and charging towards Downing Street. So that was a man who clearly had violence in his heart at that point, and which is why he'd been followed for an awful long time by the security service and the police. So it's very, very difficult to put everybody into one camp when you actually look at evidentially at these people. But there is no doubt that if you're going to kind of conceive of risk, there is risk in relation to each individual case. And I think one of the problems we've had with the Begum case is, in terms of the information in the public domain, we just don't know what the risk is that the Home Secretary believes that she presents to the UK. We haven't actually seen that evidence yet. It's not come out in any part of the trial yet. So it's a very, very difficult question for us to actually factually answer actually what it is that makes it such a risk to the UK.
A very interesting point. One thing I want to get your thoughts on is this suggestion that a international court should be set up to deal with all foreign fighters in the region, possibly with Nuremberg-esque trials. Is something like that practical? Would we have enough states who want to sign up for it? Or is it completely contingent on US and UN foreign pressure?
Well, I think the SDF would be happy to consider it, or would have been happy to consider it up until when the Americans pulled out. However, nobody in the region will allow that to happen with the SDF, because that would be their first step towards a proto-state of Kurdistan, or they'd use that to argue that. At the moment, you have the Iraq pathway of 10-minute trials and chopping your head off afterwards. So the region doesn't lend itself to a great deal of credibility for standards of evidence and balance of proof being established. So I guess a Nuremberg style thing would have to be in a jurisdiction that has some track record of providing standards of proof, evidential considerations, and fairness. And I don't think anyone in those jurisdictions or the available jurisdictions is stepping up to the mark to offer themselves up so far.
Yeah, just to comment on that, I think Tasnime's put that very diplomatically. Essentially, you're talking about Syria and Iraq here. Iraq, which is dominated by Iranian regime influence, where the means of justice, as he mentioned, is a pseudo trial for a few minutes and then execution. Or, in Syria, where you have literally 700,000 people slaughtered by the regime, about 100,000 within the prisons set up of just Syrian people. I don't think we can rely on these regimes. And the problem with having a Nuremberg type trial set up is that they would be the regimes that, the Iranian Khomeinist regime and the Assadist regime would probably be a bigger kind of fear for them than individuals who've gone and joined ISIS. So I can't see them buying into that.
I also saw a document somewhere where the proposal for the Iraqis to deal with these issues, that the bill that the Iraqis were demanding was $2.6 million per individual. So, yeah.
Not exactly palatable. And something else to discuss is public opinion. We've touched upon it briefly over the course of this discussion. 75% of the public, I think it's surveyed recently, said that they were against repatriation. I think some professionals have described it as political suicide to initiate some sort of program which has so much opposition in the public arena. So is it the case that any policy of repatriation would have to be contingent on some sort of foreign pressure, when no government would seemingly be rational in deciding to put something like that forward and probably disenfranchise their electorate?
Well, the thing is that there are consequences to not fulfilling international obligations. So, for example, again, going back to the Shamima Begum case, where you have Bangladesh as a nation where the UK, the then Home Secretary, has imputed that Shamima Begum is a Bangladeshi national despite never having been there. Well, the Bengalis and the government of Bangladesh are not very happy about that position. They don't see why they should take on the negatives of individuals from another state thrown at them by virtue of their parentage, really, or their heritage. So eventually that can work in reverse then, where those governments, let's say, that are prisoner exchanges, they just won't happen, where a national from the UK who's in the UK can elect to go to Bangladesh to serve their sentence out, or in Pakistan or any of these other countries. That will simply stop, really. We have an international framework because it overall suits all of our purposes in order to, countries' purposes, in order to function as a world. But the minute where we start saying, well, we're not having foreigners come in here because they're not conducive to the public good, fair enough. But then when you say, well, we're not having our own and we're going to foist them on others, well, then you can't have your cake and eat it without consequence. And there will be consequences.
My question then is it the government's responsibility to make those consequences known to the public?
Well, the government's job is to govern, really. So we have a democracy, and that informs us in terms of the timbre or the colour of the policy colour of the government that's there. But ultimately, they're supposed to make a decision. Now, at the moment, we seem to have a government that's policies dictated to by right-wing media, really, at the moment. And that's not serving us too well, really. It is the responsibility of government to make decisions, be they popular, be they unpopular. And governments don't always pander to public opinion. If we did, we'd have the death penalty 30 years ago, or reinstate it tomorrow, because the majority of the public would happily reinstate the death penalty when it comes to paedophiles, maybe terrorists. So
I don't think Priti Patel's against reinstating the death penalty, just for the sake of the record.
Well, I think you might well be right.
We're just going to come to questions from the audience in a moment. So if you have any, please get ready and raise your hand in a few minutes' time. Another question I kind of wanted to ask was about the issue of eventually releasing certain individuals. We've talked about those who commit to the most heinous crime. Surely the only compromise there is that they're in prison indefinitely or for life. But for many, they will be released. There's a certain issue that's often brought up in security literature, and that is of radicalization in prison. We've got two counterterrorism practitioners here, and I just wanted to explore a bit more the kind of efficacy of de-radicalization programs. Perhaps, Rashad, you can start us off.
So I think the problem with the whole discussion about the efficacy of de-radicalization programs is it's built on so much background information, it's really hard to address properly. So I think the first thing is people think, what are you saying? You're saying that we can talk to these people. They say, okay, I believe you. I no longer want to go around killing people. Ergo, we take it from them. They have changed. And so we just release them back into the populace. So this is the kind of caricature of what de-radicalization is supposed to be. Actually, it's not at all anything like that. What we're talking about is how do you make assessments of a person's cognitive, behavioral psychology? How do we look at the way they think, the way they behave? What are their motivations? What is it that stimulates them, and so on? Can we make a proper assessment of those things? Whether it's people who are specialists, whether it's the psychiatrists and psychologists, whether it's by gathering lots of information about that individual from the various people that have interaction and touch points with them, whether that's a specialist interventionist, whether that's someone who's engaging in ideological engagement, whether that's the forensic psychiatrist who's making the analysis, or whether that's the information provided by guards, etc. So there's a whole complex process for that type of assessment that takes place. That doesn't mean it's infallible again. It just means that it's much more complicated than people think, or as is presented. Secondly, in terms of dealing with this, some of the problems have been that, in order to create the right environment where this can take place, often there are various different sentences that are more or less conducive to producing an environment where de-radicalization or disengagement from violence can actually take place. Just simply put, for some people, longer sentences have that effect and that impact. For others, it is the case that you need a combination of dealing with them as a holistic individual, and being able to work on disengagement and ideological de-radicalization. And that is something that, yes, we have done successfully with hundreds of individuals. and there hasn't been recidivism. They haven't gone back into it, or even gone back into those circles where they are now interacting and engaging with radical elements. So it's not that there's no evidence for this, it's just that it's very difficult to put together in a way that fits a simple snapshot for a tabloid argument, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think just on the kind of practical level of how governments are meant to be or trying to deal with prison radicalisation, which obviously is an issue that is not by any means restricted to the UK. I mean, in the UK, we've taken an approach with what are assessed to be some of the most dangerous influences in prison, that there's these separation centres we use now. So some of the inmates assessed to be the most influential, the most dangerous, and there's a question about how you define that, but certainly the most influential have been put away from the rest of the prison population because they don't want them to, the UK authorities don't want them to be an influence on the rest of the inmates in the prison. You've got a country like France, which took a slightly different approach for a while, where they tried this experimental approach where they took people who have been convicted of terrorism offences, but they assessed to be at the less radical, less serious end, put them in a separate part of the prison. This was an experiment they tried, I think in 2016, I think. And they gave them classes on religion, access to psychologists, skills classes and things like that, and made an effort to try and begin the reintegration process. And what happened was that the people that they'd assessed to be less radical kind of conspired together, and one of the individuals, a guy called Bilal Taghi, stabbed one of the prison guards and said he did it in the name of the Islamic State. And so I don't say that to criticize the French way of doing it, because we're all trying to figure out the best way to deal with what's a really, really tricky problem, because the consequences, I mean, we've seen this happen in the UK over the last 12 months. A terrorist attack occurs, and it's somebody who's previously been in prison, and all sorts of questions are asked about, well, what the hell was going on in there? Why wasn't he being tracked afterwards? It becomes unbelievably messy. To be honest, I just don't think we have the answer yet to the best way to deal with this, and we're still trying to figure it out.
I mean, there are just, in any given population, there are just some nutters, really, and there's nothing you can do about that, really. Pick any particular group, there are some absolute lunatics out there, and that's just the risk of society, really. They're from any particular ilk, and until we start framing this in terms of going out on the street, you can get hit by a car, you could get, there are terroristic people of all sorts of different ilks out there, and there are just straight up criminals who have a desire to kill and actually cloak themselves in a political message in order to give them credibility. Those are two very different things. Somebody who's religious and then is then motivated to, through a political cause, do something, versus a complete killer who's cloaking themselves in a religious garb in order to justify his murderous nature. So there are no answers for a very small group of people.
And that's something actually that the psychologist who wrote and devised the main scheme in the UK himself said, Chris Dean. So he wrote the system which was in place when Usman Khan, who carried out the Fishmongers Hall attack, in which he killed 2 people, that he went through before his release from prison. And what Chris Dean says, we interviewed him at the beginning of this year, was that talk of a cure misses the point. There are some people, he says a cure is just a bogus kind of explanation of what goes on. There are some people who look like they're making progress, but they will then regress because the unique nature of their personality and their psychological and psychiatric makeup. He says it's a very, very complex thing. So the idea that you can actually cure these people just simply isn't the case. So if you factor that in with the stuff that Robin's been saying about the different ways of actually managing these people, where and how do you warehouse them? It's not quite clear to me in the work we've done as journalists that any nation anywhere has actually found an answer to any of these problems.
Thank you for that. So now I'm going to defer to a question from the audience. We have a raised hand here. Sean, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and you can ask your question to the panelists.
Thank you very much. Evening. Hope you can all hear me okay. And first of all, thanks for a really interesting discussion. I should declare a brief interest. I'm a prevent coordinator, so I was really pleased to hear the panel talk about the efficacy of our DRAD and our disengagement efforts. But my question revolves around the security implications, in the sense that we've talked a lot about what the risk is of bringing individuals home and what that might mean for security in the UK, and how do we mitigate that risk, how do we assess that risk. But what do the panel think could be the security implications of leaving these individuals in situ, and would that have any short or long-term implications for the UK? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Well, I mean, one of the implications is happening right now, which is that people are escaping from these refugee centres, some through smugglers being paid for, others just through failures in security, and they're disappearing into the ether. Some portion of them are being recaptured, but you have to remember that a place like Al-Hol wasn't designed for 60, 70,000 people to be housed, and we're relying on a ragtag rebel group to maintain security, which is the SDF. They're not trained particularly in guard duties. They're not trained in even particularly militarily. Having been out there, some of the people on guard duty are illiterate in their own language. Really, they're not particularly well equipped as well. So the threat of those places hemorrhaging out is very, very real, and it has already happened. Al-Hol hemorrhaged a lot of people when after the Americans left. Those people may disappear back into Syria and could pop up anywhere. But the other issue is that, well, what of all the children there who've been effectively dispossessed? That's a problem that will grow. Those children being educated not by any teachers, but by the people in those camps, who are a very concentrated group of the most hardcore sort of ISIS adherents, and that's a problem that's not that far away. Some of these kids are 7, 8, 9, 10. Now you can imagine in less than a decade, you'll have people who are young adults who have no history anywhere, and suddenly start appearing in different places with a skill set that no one can even begin to fathom. So I think the problem is immediate and also medium term.
I'm going to answer this in a slightly different way and say that, obviously, because we talk a bit about the security implications, I think one of the things that also probably is not talked about as much is it also has geopolitical implications. So the Americans are deeply unhappy with Europe on this. The attitude of because essentially the Americans are the ones who are fighting the bill for the camps and often involved one way or another with their running, certainly have influence there. And the fact that European governments, not all but most, have been so reluctant to take any of their fighters back is of significant concern in Washington, and I think is it's a split between Europe and the US that should get more attention. And I take another thing. So, for example, we've just had the Brits who have landed in Virginia this week to receive trial in the US to British ISIS fighters. When the Americans started getting lectures from the British on how exactly the trial should take place and things around the death penalty, and obviously the US government was respectful of those concerns and took the death penalty off the table. It doesn't do much to help relations between the US and Europe when you've got European countries who aren't willing to take their citizens back, And B, when America starts doing the job for them, starts lecturing them on how exactly the trial should take place. I understand why Europeans have, I understand all sides on it. I understand why Europeans governments aren't keen to take their fights back because they've already got such a big security threat. But I think you also got to understand from the American point of view that they're not wild about the status quo either. So there's the security implications, but I think there's also the geopolitical side, which we sometimes forget about.
Very interesting consideration. Yeah.
So
sorry, Rashad. I'm gonna have to cut you off because we are just running over, and I just want to allow one more question from the audience. Emily, I'm allowing you to talk now.
Hi, I just want to say thank you. But what's the situation like regarding repatriation of Western secular fighters who went out to fight against ISIS with groups such as the PKK, given that the PKK is deemed a terrorist organization by the EU? I suppose I'm asking whether governments are more likely to repatriate these individuals than individuals who went out to fight with ISIS. Are they more likely to take these individuals back and then prosecute them as opposed to trying to keep them out of the country? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's been a problem with those people coming back. I don't think any of them admit to fighting with the PKK. They tend to say that they were with the YPG, which is not a prescribed organization, but was set up by the PKK. I think the only example of one who was successfully prosecuted was Aidan James, I think. And the only reason he was prosecuted was because he was in a camp where there were PKK fighters as well as YPG fighters. But that's the only successful prosecution. There have been a number of arrests, I think 4 or 5 now, but those prosecutions collapsed. So I don't think there's actually a big issue around that. Also, when the YPG were fighting against ISIS, a lot of their endeavors were supported by the RAF as well. So it's going to be somewhat difficult for a prosecution to be successful when the alleged offence is one that was militarily supported by the Royal Air Force. But there we go.
Would anyone like to add any further comments? Absolutely fine. I think we'll wrap up there. We've just gone slightly over, but thank you so much to all of our fantastic panelists for lending their expert opinion today. It's been a real pleasure. I'd also like to extend a thank you to our sponsors, T45. We're going to be back next Friday with an event on electoral interference, so be sure to tune in then. Thank you all for joining, and goodbye.